focus on Human Rights Day is not just South Africa, but also how the world is doing in terms of observing human rights, Michael. And it's always such an interesting issue to look at, because while in theory the policy or the legislature, the law might be there, of course, enforcement is everything. So talk to us about what this rule of law index is, and what are the indicators that they look at to determine whether, in fact, we're progressing or regressing?
Yeah, as you said, Kathy, it's not all about what's actually written in the legislation, what's written in terms of the rules. It's also about the culture that's promoting human rights in the first place. For example, is the government open about its policies? Is the country secure and stable? Is it dealing with crime? So those are some of the subsectors that we're going to look at. And we'll start with South Africa itself. This Rule of Law Index ranked 113 countries in terms of a variety of factors. South Africa finishing 44th in the world with a score of just under 0.6, Kathy. And we're going to get some context as we look at other countries. Venezuela, perhaps not surprisingly, finishing bottom of the pile, a score of 0.3, ranked 113 in the world. Who finished top? Well, Denmark was number one, a score of just under 0.9, Kathy. So do the math, and we're effectively smack bang in the middle of those two countries. We really are pretty average in terms of our score. But an area of concern for South Africa, we have slipped to second on the continent. So Ghana has just sneaked ahead of South Africa, in fact, over the past year in terms of its ranking. It's now in position number 43. And just to give you some context again, when it comes to the superpowers, Kathy, this is where the plot thickens. The United States, of course, famous for its history of democracy, it got a score of 0.73, and it's ranked 19th in the world, Kathy. So that perhaps surprising a few people. China, well, ranked 75th. Of course, it doesn't have the best human rights record. It's getting a score of exactly 0.50. And I want to hone in very quickly, once we've got that context, on some of the subset factors when it comes to South Africa's score. So fundamental rights, those sorts of things which are enshrined in our constitution, which you mentioned, positions us ranked 44 in the world. Not too bad, as I said, relatively average. We do quite well when it comes to government transparency, top 34. Constraint on government powers, in other words, making sure that the executive isn't able to take control of the state, for instance, ranked 41. But this is a concern, Kathy, corruption, dragging our overall score down. We are ranked 49th in the world when it comes to bribery and graft, that sort of thing. A quick look at our judicial system, and again, we do relatively well here, Kathy, in terms of civil justice, 35th in the world. Enforcement of regulations, in other words, the rules and laws governing our society, we're ranked 40th. But that number at the bottom, Kathy, is really, I think, what it must be of the most concern for government. Order and security, we're ranked 89th in the world. And remember, there were 113 countries in this particular survey. So that must be a concern. Crime is really getting in the way of our culture of human rights.
So under that order and security, I'm thinking about the number of protests that we have in this country that may be one of the driving factors under that sub-criteria. But what are they really talking about there?
Well, one thing that we can be proud of is that we don't have a major civil conflict, in the sense there's no civil war. So we score a solid 100% effectively on that measure. But crime, both in a residential area, for instance, or in the business environment, Kathy, it seems to be dragging us down. So we're scoring roughly 49% in terms of the crime measure, and even worse when it comes to incidents of violent redress. So typically that would be, for instance, a case of mob justice, where South Africans will take justice into their own hands, perhaps identify someone who may have committed a crime and deal with them particularly violently. And our scores here are below average when compared to the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. So crime really in this survey emerging as a real problem when it comes to human rights.
All right. Well, it looks like overall relatively good positioning for South Africa on a global perspective. But of course, we'll find out what some of the human rights organizations also have to say, and also take a look at the outlook of different countries from an international relations perspective on the enforcement of human rights.